And for anyone that missed at the start, my name is Francis Lively. I work in the beef research team up at AFBI, and some of the data I'll be presenting is also assisted with is Denise Lowe and two of our PhD students, Naomi Rutherford and Lauren Chestnut. So really just in terms of nutrition and in terms of what do we be offering to cattle, there's 5 basic requirements we need to give cattle to make sure that they grow, perform and do well. The first main requirement is water. And really, water, we sort of very often overlook water, but water is the key requirement. So it's really important, particularly in the winter time, to ensure a good supply of clean water is presented. In terms of energy and protein, that's really in the feed that we give to the animals, and I'll go through that in a little bit more detail next. I'm not covering it tonight, but minerals and vitamins, obviously critically important for nutrition, and really important that you have a good supply of minerals and vitamins supplied to the cattle, just to make sure that they're healthy and well. But the actual performance of cattle is very dependent on a number of factors. Very often, as a scientist, we get asked, I'm feeding cattle, I'm giving them X number of kilos of feed, and expect them to be doing, and it's predicted that they should do a kilo of live weight gain a day or a kilo and a half of live weight gain a day. And very often, there's cattle maybe do not do what they're expected to do. And there's a range of factors in that. And really how animals perform, in addition to the nutrition, there's lots of different factors. There's the age of the animal, there's the gender, the breed type, and even very often we sort of get into this whole debate over what's the best breed or what's the worst breed. But the thing to remember is the genetic potential of the animal, and there's more variation within breed than there is between breed. So we'll certainly be keeping away from talking specifically about breeds. In terms of the feedstuff itself, it's how an animal performs really is how much do you supply the animal feedstuff. A lot of the work we have done at Hillsborough over the years, we've been feeding animals ad lib feed. Now ad lib feed is when there is feed in front of the animal 24/7. It's not a case you feed them in the morning, you go back to look them in the evening, and they've a little bit left, and you say that'll do them okay to the morning. That's maybe only 80% of what an ad lib diet would be. So really supply of feedstuff is important. Quality of feedstuff, obviously a key driver, and the quality really we're normally thinking of the energy and protein. And then there's other factors, previous nutrition, how well have they been fed in their, in the period up to when you're currently feeding them, and then the previous growth. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to hopefully run through some of these factors and just explain a little bit more about those factors, go into them in a little bit more detail. And then I'll finish up by giving a summary of some recent trials that have just finished at Hillsborough. In terms of energy, we talked about energy. Energy is really what you supply to the animal to get to make the animal thrive. So really, the energy is really the fuel you put into the animal to make the animal survive. And in terms of the feedstuff that you put into the animal, a lot of that goes into maintenance. So you've got to really fill that maintenance requirements. And it's only once you start to overfill that maintenance requirement is when you start getting live weight gain. And we sort of predict it's about 35 to 45 megajoules of energy per kilogram of live weight gain, and that's over maintenance. So if you're thinking of an animal growing, if you just offer it maintenance and a little bit more than maintenance, it'll take it a lot longer to reach slaughter, to reach the end point, than if you feed it a high level of feed, well over maintenance. So and that sort of explains just how animals, how you have to feed them well to make sure you're getting a good live weight gain. Generally, younger animals, in terms of the carcass and a little graph down in the bottom corner, you can see just sort of how an animal's carcass composition changes, how the animal changes with time. If you think of the animal, if you think of a carcass, it comprises muscle, fat, and bone, and really the proportion of energy that's going into all these different things differs as the animal increases in live weight or gets older. Younger animals tend to have a higher growth and put more of the energy you supply to them into muscle. And muscle obviously has a higher protein requirement than fat. Once an animal gets close to its mature weight, it then puts less, it's not gaining as much weight, and it puts more of the energy, more of the feed you put into it, it then converts that into fat. And that's why you can see this here little graph at the bottom. As the animal approaches its mature weight, certainly more of the energy goes into fat. And throughout that whole system, when you're feeding an animal, a lot of that feed, in addition to running the animal, a lot of that is lost to the environment. So it's either lost as heat production, lost as methane, feces, or urine. And it's only really when you oversupply that you end up with retained energy or retained performance in the animal, growth of the animal. In terms of protein, and protein is really required for all body functions, and really also to encourage appetite as well. Protein requirements vary according to age, according to growth rate, according to gender, but in general terms, the general protein requirement of cattle decreases as they get more mature. As they get more mature, they're putting down less muscle, and they don't have as high a protein requirement. Generally, we think of growing cattle require total diets of around 14 to 16%, finishing cattle a lower protein content of 11 to 14%. In terms of response to protein, obviously protein tends to be more expensive. If you're thinking of concentrates, protein tends to be more expensive. So in terms of response to money, younger animals respond better than older animals because they have a higher growth potential. Bulls respond better than steers, which respond better than heifers. And as we think about the muscle, the more muscular animals, continental animals, will respond better than less conformed animals. And very often we're asked, what is the ideal protein content that you should have? And really, that is largely dependent on the forage quality. So if you're thinking of the protein in your diet, in your concentrate, it's really, there's a lot of factors there you've got to take into consideration. But your forage quality would be number one, how much protein's in your forage quality. And then the other aspect is how much meal are you feeding. If you're feeding, if it's say store cattle and you're feeding very little meal, you might have to put in a higher concentrate. Whereas if you're feeding a lot of meal, you could go with a lower content. The other aspect in terms of protein content is really if you're trying to encourage fat deposition. So if you're trying to put more fat on the carcass. So Seamus talked earlier about trying to get more steers down into slaughtered at earlier or at lighter carcasses. So he talked about 14% going from 380 to 400 kilos. And if you just slaughter them at an earlier age, there's a possibility that those would be leaner and you'd be getting penalised on a fat class. So really, if that's the case, you would encourage more fat deposition by going in the finishing period with a lower protein. So really, at that stage, you're probably all confused. But really, feeding beef cattle, the nutrition it's not totally simple. It is quite a complex aspect. And it does vary a lot with the type of animal that you're dealing with, and really what you put in can be quite varied. This maybe summarises 3 categories of animals we have in Northern Ireland. We've got some large continental type animals, we've got some early maturing type animals, and then we've got the dairy genetics. And really, to make it even more complex, on every farm, and certainly I'd say if you go into most finishing farms, there's a mixture of all these, and there's crossbreeds of all these types in it. So it is quite complex. But certainly for feeding cattle, it is recommended to take all the breed types and try to group them according to the type they are, to really and size that they are, to try to actually alter the nutrition to ensure that you try to get them to your ideal carcass specification. I said earlier, your larger continental animals are obviously heavier and will have a higher maintenance requirement. Being heavier muscled, you get a better response to protein. to grow them on, to have high growth potential. But the downside to that, if you're wanting to slow them up in the finishing time, and really not so much slow them up, but stop them putting down muscle and put more of their energy into fat, you will have to look at the diet and go with a higher energy finishing ration to ensure that you get that fat cover if you're killing them at lower carcass weights. On the other hand, your early maturing breeds, and certainly we heard earlier about how the likes of the Angus has increased in popularity. And someone that's moving from, say, Continentals to, say, the early maturing breed and that type of cattle, it is worth bearing in mind you need to feed these cattle differently. If you go in with your high energy diet that you might have been used with on your Continental, you could end up with a lot of fat carcasses. So really just to bear in mind, you do need to alter your nutrition based on the type of cattle that you've got. The dairy animals, on the other hand, they are obviously bred for milk, and bred for milk. A lot of Holsteins, they have a large internal digestive tract, and that takes a lot more energy, and they are less efficient than your beef animals. And a lot more of the energy you put in ends up going into, and particularly in the finishing period, ends up going into internal fat in around the digestive tract. And most of that, whenever they're slaughtered, that goes into the bin instead of to you. And that's why we certainly with on intensive dairy bred cattle, we do recommend slaughtering at lighter weights. This graph now just shows the effect of slaughter weight on breed type and gender. And in terms of looking at feed conversion efficiency, and really feed conversion ratio is the kilograms of dry matter feed into the animal divided by the carcass gain of the animal. And really a couple of points I just want to make with this slide is our Continental suckler cattle, in this slide here, we're looking at steers at the top, these little triangulars at the top of the screen, relative to the square boxes at the bottom. And you can see steers, it takes a lot more feed to feed steers than it does to feed bulls, so they're less efficient. If we look at the slope of these two lines, our dairy-bred cattle, these were dairy-bred bulls slaughtered from 300 to 550 kilogram live weight. And you can see actually it's quite a steep line there. So it just shows as those bulls get larger, they're becoming less efficient in terms of producing carcass weight. And a lot of that reason is because they're putting a lot of the feed that we were feeding to them was going into energy and going into fat, internal fat that was of no value to the producer. Continental animals, obviously, as they increase in live weight, they do obviously decrease in feed efficiency as they reach the mature weight, but they are still very efficient even to large weights, albeit we do know we no longer are asked to produce large carcasses. So really, in terms of nutrition, you do have to consider the carcass specification. And what we'd strongly recommend is really just look at the type of cattle and really pen them accordingly. One of the most key take-homes would be to measure, and it's really important to weigh your animals. If you know the weight of the animals and you can then alter your diet to suit the weight of the animals. And certainly monitor your fat cover, and certainly Kieran will talk more about that, to ensure that you don't have large lean cattle whenever they're ready for slaughter. And then really manage your nutrition to suit the type of cattle you have. And hopefully the end product would be a carcass within specification. Now I'm going to mention compensatory growth. A lot of people are out buying cattle at the moment and buying cattle through the ring. And very often you buy cattle and you take them home and you feed them. And some cattle do extremely well and some cattle don't do just as well. And very often this can be down to compensatory growth. And that is basically better than expected growth performance seen in animals during a period of low performance. So if you have animals that have been on a restricted diet, or animals that have basically been sort of stored maybe during the summer or during the winter, if you take them home and put them on a high quality diet, their performance will actually they will perform really well, and that's compensatory growth. Very often we use it in the springtime, so if you're putting cattle out in the spring, we might take the concentrate out of the ration before they go out to grass for the last six or 8 weeks. And by and large, if they're given a good plane of nutrition, you will actually end up with the same weight as housing as you would with cattle that were fed right up to turnout. We do also see it this time of the year in the autumn. So cattle that come into the house that have been well grazed, or normally cattle that come into the house that's been pushed with meal during the later part of the season, they tend not to do as well once you put them into the house. And that's sort of the controversy of compensatory growth. Because they've been going well and then taken into the house, they mightn't just perform as well. Now I'm going to focus a little bit on grass. And a lot of our research at AFBI at the moment is focused on grass. And grass is the cheapest feed available for beef cattle in Northern Ireland. If we compare the price of grass, the cost per kilo of grass relative to concentrate, grass is certainly the cheapest feed we can put into animals. We do know it's a very highly nutritious feedstuff, but the quality does vary throughout the season. And you can see in this growth curve here, you can see how the energy and protein content and dry matter does decline, and certainly it will be in decline at the moment. So you very often hear people saying about the quality is certainly less in the autumn, and that is correct. However, even though it is low, if it's well managed and you're giving cattle short loose grass, it is still a very high quality feedstuff. I'm just going to now mention a few studies at Hillsborough and really just highlight some of the performance that we have been getting from cattle. So this first table is a study that we've had on Holstein bulls that were put out for a grazing period. So some of them are put out for a grazing period and some were housed on ad-lib feed. And if we think of the performance of them, these first two columns, grazed or grazed plus 2 kilos of meal, was really just, if we compare the summer live weight gain, was about 0.9 on the cattle that were grazed at grass. So 0.9 kilograms per day was what we achieved on these calves that were rotationally grazed. Their counterparts that got 2 kilos of meal did 1.15 kilos per day during that grazing period. There's another group, and they were out at grass with ad-lib meal, and they were doing almost 1.7 kilos per day. And then the group in the house were doing about 1.6 kilos per day during that growth phase at grass. When we took them in and finished them after a finishing period, so basically they were all taken in and worked up onto ad-lib concentrates, and the grazed cattle were actually up to 1.5 kilos per day. The grazed in 2 kilos, just not as high, and then the two ad-lib groups, certainly in the finishing period, did not just have as high a performance. So it really demonstrates the compensatory growth kicking in there. And really, I suppose, in terms of whether you feed a small amount of meal at grass or you feed no meal at grass, certainly those cattle, once it came to slaughter, there was no difference in carcass weight in the grazed or the grazed plus 2 kilos. So in actual fact, we could have saved, these cattle were grazed for 100 days. You could have saved 200 kilograms of meal out of the production cost of those animals. Just looking at another study, thinking in the autumn time, and these were continental type cattle, and these cattle started, half of them got no meal throughout the grazing season, half got 2.5 kilos from the 1st of July through to housing in start of October. And during the grazing period, the ones on the 2.5 kilos did almost 0.9 kilos per day, whereas the grass only just did 0.6 kilos per day. And there was a difference in terms of housing weight. So if you're going out to sell those cattle, obviously it may have been beneficial to have had some meal going in. However, once they were finished and taken through to slaughter, there was no difference in slaughter live weight. So again, sort of really stressing the fact that actually if you're taking them right through, you could really have saved the meal. And really this time of the year, feeding meal at grass isn't that beneficial. All you really end up doing is poaching. If the cattle are going to go into the house for a finishing period, there's no point in feeding grass at meal or feeding meal at grass. Take them into the house and just feed them the meal in the house. It'll save poaching the ground and creating a problem for next year's grazing season. As we approach housing time, and Kieran will go into more detail, silage quality is obviously important. This is just two studies, one on Holstein bulls and one on continental bulls, where we offered cattle, where cattle had either ad-lib concentrates or half of the concentrate diet was replaced on a dry matter basis with high quality grass silage. And if we look at the finishing live weight gain, very similar very similar performance from these animals. So it really shows you, this really demonstrates that high quality grass silage can reduce some of the cost, the finishing cost, by reducing the meal requirement. So really just a summary from myself. Meeting the nutritional requirements of beef cattle is complex, but it certainly is important to look at the type of cattle you're working with, and remember that energy and protein content should be altered to ensure that you're getting the right nutrition and you're getting the best performance from them. Compensatory growth can offer an opportunity to reduce the concentrate amount and reduce the cost of production, provided there's an adequate period of finishing afterwards. Don't underestimate the quality and growth potential from high quality grass or grass silage.